In order to study the Hebrew Bible academically, the first thing to understand is that it's not just one big book. It is over 1,000 years of collected materials of folklore and battle chronicles and legislation and songs that were collected together at a certain point in time and made into a written text out of a long, long oral tradition. The thing that triggered that was the Babylonian captivity. Babylon conquered the southern kingdom of Israel in the 6th century BC. And their policy for maintaining what they conquered was to take a portion of the population back to the home city, the important people, the interesting people, the artisans and literate ones, and have them live outside the walls of Babylon where they could keep an eye on them. And they had to stay out of trouble because they were in foreign territory with no friends. And the majority of the population that you left back in the conquered region, they had to just go to work and pay taxes and not give you any trouble, because if they did, they would take their anger out on the people back in Babylon. And so the Bible became a book outside the walls of Babylon amongst the population that found themselves ripped from their homeland and suddenly plunged into this giant cosmopolitan, and to their eyes, most decadent city they'd ever seen in their lives. And they didn't know how long they would be there. They're going to be raising their children and the grandchildren outside the walls of this giant city with over 1 million people. How would they maintain their culture? How would they keep their children from wandering off and blending into Babylonian society? This was the fear that triggered them into turning their long traditions into a text. But it came from a lot of different sources. And so there's a whole lot to unpack if you're going to analyze this academically and historically. The thing you must keep in mind whenever you're studying it is that while all of these stories are very old, they change over the centuries until they were put down in writing. So what we're looking at when we study the Hebrew Bible is primarily a frozen slice of time, the 6th century BCE. We see their version of the stories at that moment in time and in the circumstance that they found themselves in. And you have to remember that stories might be very old, but they change with the retelling. They evolve and adapt to new situations. By analogy, it's kind of like in grade school when you played the telephone game. You got in a big circle, somebody said something to the person next to them, whatever they thought they heard, they said to the next person, and so on. By the time I got around the circle, it had often very much changed. And that's what happens in telling stories. As stories are passed down through generations, through the years, they adapt to changing times, they take on new dimensions, elements become more pronounced later that maybe didn't matter as much before, and earlier things maybe fall out of emphasis because they no longer mattered later on. Just in telling your own stories, you alter them as you get practice telling your stories. The interesting parts you tend to ramp up a little bit, and the dull parts you tend to truncate so that you tell your own stories better. You edit your own memories as you retell them. And this happens universally. And so it's happened in the Hebrew Bible. It'd be great if we had earlier versions of these stories to compare to what was then written later, but we don't. We have what we have. So that's what we study. Now, because we're interested in understanding historically the origins of the people that created the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, we have to find a way to peer through that brick wall that is the 6th century BCE. We want to find earlier conceptions and evidence of earlier ways that they thought about their God. Well, one important way that you can do this, something that folklorists and anthropologists and mythologists make use of, is to look for old songs in the written text. Because while the stories have changed over time, the songs remain the same. Think about your favorite song from 10 years ago, 20 years ago, when you were a little kid, something that you sang in front of the mirror because you love this song. You might not have sung it for years. You might not have thought about it for a long time. But all you got to do is just start tapping your foot, get that rhythm going in your head, and I'll bet you can sing every single lyric of your favorite song without missing a single word. How is that possible? Songs are different than stories. Songs have something that stories don't. They have rhythm, rhyme, and repetition. And these serve as mnemonic devices. They make them stick in our minds. And that's why you can conjure them up. And you can pass them down for centuries, and they won't change. We demonstrate this every year at New Year's Eve in the English-speaking world. At the stroke of midnight, the ball drops, fireworks go off, people kiss, and then the old folks break out into this old song called Auld Lang Syne. You know the song. What in the world does Auld Lang Syne even mean? People sing these words, the shape of these words, without even knowing what the words mean. Now, Auld Lang Syne is English, but it's 17th century sort of Scottish dialect of English. It's from an old drinking song. It refers to, days long past. It's a nostalgic kind of a reference, right? But that song came over with the people that settled in America, and it was an important song, and it was remembered and it's passed down. And even though the way that we speak has changed since the days of Shakespeare and in the 17th century, the shape and sound of those words are still sung today, even though our language for speaking no longer matches it. Because that is the power of rhythm, rhyme, and repetition, to make a song in its lyrics stick in your head in a way that it's just impossible for a mere story. So if we can find old songs that were also incorporated into the written text of the Bible, then if we know when the song was first written, we're on pretty sure ground that we're looking further back in time and seeing language and metaphors and imagery that go back to the original composition that haven't changed so much over time. So where do we find old songs in the Hebrew Bible? Well, there's a whole collection of them called the Psalms. Now, the Psalms by tradition were written by King David, who is famous for expanding the empire, for being a blatant womanizer, and for writing songs to the Lord. Now, in your Bible today, most of those songs are not written by King David. If you have a good academic Bible, if you have a New Revised Standard Version, modern translation, it'll probably have some scholarly apparatus, introductions that tell you the language tells us this is an 8th century priest, or other people wrote them. And that was very common back then. When writing was a very rare activity, only practiced by a specialized few, the rules for writing are not the same as they are for us today. So if you wrote something that you felt was important, but you yourself were not important and you wanted people to read it, then what you might do is just put a famous guy's name on it, or add it to a collection of known writings by a famous person. You just add it to the Davidian collection in this sense. So most of the Psalms are not by King David. Even if they sound archaic and Bronze Age-ish, it could just be some later priest writing nostalgically or trying to capture the flavor of those early songs. We need one that David really wrote. So which one could it possibly be? Well, probably the one I had you read for today's class, Psalm 18, is going to be the one. Why? Not just because it sounds archaic and Bronze Age-ish, but because all the lyrics of Psalm 18 are repeated verbatim in another book in the Hebrew Bible. If you want to dredge up 2 Samuel 22, you'll find the exact same song, word for word, identical, also copied there. What would be so important about this particular hymn that it followed two different oral tradition paths and two different contributors to the Hebrew Bible both put it in there? The obvious answer is it really was by King David. It was a song from the beloved old hero king of the old days, and several priests had remembered it. And so it survives there. So that's why we're on the most sure ground possible. You can also find songs in other parts of the Hebrew Bible. As you're reading it in translation, most likely, you'll notice that the text is double-side justified as you go down. You're reading stories. But every once in a while, the text will start getting all funky in its indentation, and it looks like the way poetry tends to be written. When that happens, that's your editor letting you know that this is a fragment of an old song that they embedded into the story. And so they do that kind of indentations to let you know, because you're used to poetry being written that way. And it is poetry. Remember, in the ancient world, poetry and music are the same thing. There was no distinction between music that you sang and poetry that you read. People didn't do that. That was well after the printing press that the habit of writing poetry and speaking it came about. Before that, poetry was always accompanied with music. It was always sung, all right? So we're going to look at a couple of old songs from the Bronze Age. Psalm 18 is our main one. We're also going to take a little look at Exodus 15, see there, which is the Song of Moses. And we'll see where it fits into the timeline as well. Now, we need to know when Psalm 18 was written. If it really was by King David, as we think it most likely was, when did he live? All right, well, that's what your timeline is for. Remember that the Hebrews have conquered a region of Canaan. They've created their settlement of Israel, and they have a lot of troubles. And so they elect their first king, around the year 1000 BCE. So we have three kings of united Israel, Saul, David, and Solomon. Solomon dies around 922. So David's in the middle of all of that. Let's say 960, 970 BCE. So the middle-ish of the 10th century BCE. That puts these song lyrics about 400 years earlier than the time when the Hebrew Bible began to take its written form that we have now. So we're looking 400 years further back in time, looking at language 400 years earlier than the majority of the language in the Hebrew Bible. So let's take a look at Psalm 18 and see what it has to say. The context is David is surrounded by his enemies. He's singing to the Lord and calling upon him for help. I love you, O Lord, my strength. The Lord is my rock, my fortress, and my deliverer. My God, my rock in whom I take refuge, my shield and the horn of my salvation, my stronghold. I call upon the Lord, who is worthy to be praised, so I shall be saved from my enemies. All right, well, big deal. I mean, what's the big whoop about that? It just sounds like Bible stuff, right? Sounds like Sunday morning at church. And see, that's the problem. We've been using the lyrics of the Psalms for Christian hymns for so many centuries that we don't really even hear the words anymore. We just get used to singing "A mighty fortress is the Lord our God." We take it very metaphorically, and we don't really pay attention to the language. But look at the metaphors that are used. Look at the imagery by which he describes God. He is his strength, rock, fortress, deliverer, refuge, shield, horn of my salvation, stronghold. What kinds of words are these? These are military terms. Stronghold, shield, horn, fortress, rock. These are militaristic terms. These are warrior words. And of course, what does King David do for a living? He's a warrior king. So of course, that's the kind of language, the kind of imagery that he's going to use. So we've got to do something to recapture the original flavor of this if we're really going to put our heads into the minds of the person that composed these lyrics. One other thing too, he's referring to him as the Lord. And in a modern Christian sense, that's how we're used to addressing the biblical God. But the biblical God actually had a name. And we're not accustomed to using that name anymore, but he does have one. Written in the Hebrew language, it would look like this. And you read it from right to left in Hebrew. This collection of four letters here is called the Tetragrammaton. Tetragrammaton. It's a very cool sounding word. It is the four-letter symbol for the name of God, right? Now, if we take this and we transliterate it into English letters, we have to reverse the order of them as well, but the closest equivalence is YHWH. You notice that's 4 consonants and no vowels. The Hebrew alphabet has 22 consonants in it, but no vowels. If you're literate, you just know where the vowel sounds are supposed to go, all right? So typically in English, we can also add some vowels and pronounce this Yahweh. And it's often spelled Yahweh with an A and E in there in modern English academic literature relating to the Bible. So we end up with Yahweh. Now, incidentally, quick sidebar. If we take Yahweh, these letters, and we put it into the Vulgate Latin that the Bible will be translated into by St. Jerome in the 4th century CE, and that'll be the Bible used through the Middle Ages, our Y becomes a J, our W becomes a V. You bring down your H's, and what does that look like to you? Jehovah, and that's where we get that. Now, none of this would have been written down in the ancient world. In an actual ancient Torah, an ancient Hebrew biblical text, they never wrote his name down. The Hebrews did not want other people annoying their God. So they didn't even want them to know the name of their God. They kept it secret. So in a Torah, any place where his name goes, what you would actually see are just 4 dots. Everybody knows what that refers to. Nobody says it too publicly, right? The name is too sacred. It's too holy, right? And that's part of why our modern habit in English translations is just to refer to him by a title, Lord, rather than his actual name at the time, right? So we have his name Yahweh. Let's go ahead and put that back in there as well. And you'll see in another little song fragment in a minute that it makes more grammatical sense to understand that he has an actual name, okay? We'll see that in a bit. All right, so let's go back and try to recapture the original flavor. Put his name in here. We're going to put the proper warrior context in here and try to sing these lyrics, chant these lyrics that captures the original flavor. Psalm 18, let's start at verse 6. In my distress, I called upon Yahweh. To my God, I cried for help. From his temple, he heard my voice, and my cry to him reached his ears. Then the earth reeled and rocked. The foundations also of the mountains trembled and quaked because he was angry. And smoke went up from his nostrils, and devouring fire from his mouth. Glowing coals flamed forth from him. He bowed the heavens and came down. Thick darkness was under his feet. He rode on a cherub and flew. He came swiftly upon the wings of the wind. He made darkness his covering around him, his canopy thick clouds dark with water. And then out of the brightness before him, there broke through his clouds hailstones and coals of fire. And Yahweh thundered in the heavens, and the Most High uttered his voice, and he sent out his arrows and scattered them. He flashed forth lightnings and routed them. Then the channels of the sea were seen. The foundations of the world were laid bare at your rebuke, O Yahweh, at the blast of the breath of your nostrils. Amen. All right. Now that's Bronze Age poetry right there. That's more what David intended when he wrote that song. You hear the imagery in this? He's barreling down the side of the mountain. He's hawking lava loogies out his nostrils, blasting everything around him. Sounds kind of pagan. Sounds like some South Sea volcano god. And that volcano imagery does show up in these very old songs a few times. It's theorized by some that in really, really early days, the Hebrews may well have seen an erupting volcano and thought, my God, the God that can do that, that's the God we want to worship. That's the one that'll give us strength to survive in these tough times. So we see that volcano imagery a lot. In any case, what we see here is an angry warrior God, a violent, brutal God that's going to come to the aid of his champion, of King David, that has called upon him for help. Right? So what do we do with these lyrics? How do we make some sense out of them? All right. Well, first thing we want to do is recognize that the ancients projected a lot of their own concerns and a lot of human personality traits upon their gods, right? And there's a term for that. It's the longest vocabulary word, I think, of the semester here. It is anthropomorphism. Anthropomorphism. Now, don't be intimidated by big words like that. Big words, just little words ganging up to look scary, right? Break them down into little words and that's not so bad. So anthropo, probably the only word you know that begins with anthropo is anthropology, right? Anthropology is the study of human origins. And so anthropo means human, right? Morph means change, specifically change of form. So human changeism, anthropomorphism. What that means is it's a word that describes the ancient habit of imagining non-human things with human characteristics. It's typically applied to how they imagine their gods with human characteristics. The Greeks, for example, made beautiful statues of their gods where they have these perfect human bodies. Like they spend all day in the gym, getting all jacked and chiseled to have their sculpture done, right? And this description of Yahweh has human characteristics. We hear nostrils and feet and ears and things like that. Now, that's not really super important. I mean, you can always chalk that up to poetic license. What's far more important are the personality traits that people projected upon their gods. Looking back to the Greeks, their god Zeus, for example, has a very famous and rather scandalous, character flaw. Zeus is a womanizer. He's horny all the time. All of his stories are full of him ravaging goddesses and princesses and little boys, and Zeus is the horniest god of ancient mythology. Why did the ancient Greeks imagine their chief god skirt chasing all the time? Well, it tells you something about, Greek men. They have a violent god that ravages women. Well, read the stories of the Trojan War, read Homer's Iliad. That's how they behave. They sacked towns, they killed the men, they ravaged the women. That's how it was back in the Bronze Age. So the personality traits that are projected upon Yahweh. Here we see one of his primary ones, which you see through a lot of the Bible, that he's angry. The Hebrews imagined that Yahweh was angry a lot. He was very quick to anger. And probably this is simply a reflection of the fact that they lived difficult lives. And although they worship this super powerful God, it seems like he was letting them suffer a lot and get punished a lot. So he must be angry with them a lot. And there's one other trait that's also projected as well. And that's the most curious one of all. He is described as being a jealous God. It's right there in the commandments, the very first one. Have no other gods before me, for I am a jealous God. Well, who's he jealous of? Other gods. He doesn't want his people worshiping other gods, which means that the Hebrews, in fact, believed that other gods were real, which means in the early Bronze Age anyway, they weren't really monotheists. That's often a discrete distinction that's made if you hear about this in church or something, that the ancient pagans were polytheists. They worship lots of gods, whereas the ancient Hebrews were monotheists. They worship just the one true God. Well, in the earliest days, the language, the mental picture that we get here does not really support that. Now, they weren't polytheists. At least they weren't supposed to be. They weren't supposed to be worshiping other gods, but they did believe those other gods were real. Otherwise, who would Yahweh be jealous of? And you see it in a lot of places as well. I remember as a kid watching that Charlton Heston 10 Commandments movie. And there's this scene where Charlton Heston playing Moses is facing down the Pharaoh, let my people go. And they have a battle between him and the Pharaoh's priests. And the Pharaoh's priests throw down their staffs and they turn into serpents and they're coming at him. All right, Moses, he ain't scared. He throws down his staff, it becomes a serpent. And his serpent staff swallows up all the other Egyptian priest serpent staffs. And the point of the story is, my God's the most powerful. I was baffled by that as a kid. It's like, wait a minute, who turned the Egyptian priest staffs into serpents? I mean, magic isn't like real, only the power of God is real. And the biblical God isn't going to help these Egyptian priests out. So how did that happen? Well, the Egyptians have their own gods, and their gods turn those staffs into serpents. The point of the story is the Hebrew God is more powerful than the other gods. He is the best God that you should worship. So there's a word for this as well. They're not monotheists in the early days, and they're not polytheists either. It's another term called Henotheism. Henotheism. It means that you accept the existence of many gods, but you only worship one. You're exclusive to a single God amongst the many that could be out there. All right. And this is supported in another place. In Exodus 15, let's turn back to that real quickly. We have the Song of Moses. And it follows Exodus 14. That's the famous chapter in which he parts the Red Sea and the Hebrews escape from the Egyptians. And then as the Pharaoh and his army tries to pursue them, then the seas come back in and they all drown and they're all destroyed. Okay, magnificent miracle, great special effects. And so Moses sings this song, chapter 15. And this time of Moses escaping Israel, this is 13th, 15th century or so BCE. This is one of the really oldest parts of the Hebrew Bible, one of the really, really old songs. And he sings. I'm going to go ahead and put Yahweh in for Lord, and you'll see why it works better. Then Moses and the Israelites sang the song to Yahweh. I will sing to Yahweh, for he has triumphed gloriously. Horse and rider is thrown into the sea. Yahweh is my strength and my might, and he's become my salvation. This is my God, and I will praise him. My father's God, and I will exalt him. Yahweh is a warrior. Yahweh is his name. Now, in your translation, it's going to say, the Lord is a warrior. The Lord is his name. You said that grammatically, it sounds kind of wonky. So it's kind of fun to put his name back in there. Makes more sense of it. All right. So then we have a whole column where he's describing the destruction that Yahweh has rained down upon the Egyptians who are pursuing them. Pharaoh's chariots and his army, he's cast into the sea. His picked officers were sunk in the Red Sea. The floods covered them. They went down like a stone, and on that goes for a while. And then at Exodus 15, verse 11, it says this: who is like you, O Yahweh, among the gods? Who is like you, majestic in holiness, awesome in splendor, doing wonders? You stretched out your right hand, and the earth swallowed them. It's pretty obvious from the grammar there that he's not saying that, Yahweh, you're the only God that exists. I'm so glad we have enough sins to worship you. What he's singing is, you were the best God. Those Egyptian gods were helpless against you. You just butt slammed them to the bottom of the Red Sea. You were the best God. So that's Henotheism. Now, eventually the Hebrews will evolve into monotheists. For that matter, so will the polytheistic pagans. By the time you get to classical Greece and you have philosophers like Plato and Aristotle talking about it, they're talking about a singular divine force. So everybody eventually becomes monotheistic, but you have to remember that monotheism is a very advanced religious concept. For the early ancients to look around at the variety and multiplicity of things in the world and say that one God's behind all of it, they weren't ready for that yet. So there's a God for the wind and a God for the waters and a God for agriculture, and there's gods for different things. So monotheism will develop among both of them, but it's important to clarify, if we're trying to understand the mindset of the earliest Hebrews, they began from the point of henotheism. Okay. All right. So what else can we say about this? He's angry. He's jealous. So we have anthropomorphic qualities projected upon them. And the jealousy thing is going to be particularly important. Right? What else might we note about this? If you grew up going to church, you also might have learned to describe God with 3 adjectives that all begin with the letter O. Those adjectives. God is omniscient, omnipresent, and omnipotent. Now the word omni, the prefix there, means all. So God is all-knowing. He is in all places. He's everywhere, and he is all-powerful. Okay? Do these advanced modern concepts apply in how the ancient Hebrews back in the Bronze Age thought about their God? Are they at that point yet? Arguably not really. Is he omniscient? If we are to take seriously the language of Psalm 18, we'll know. David is on the battlefield and he calls to God and his voice reaches his ears. And then Yahweh turns and, what ho, David is in trouble. And then he goes down to help him. All right. So it seems to take a little time before this knowledge comes to him. So he doesn't seem to be depicted as all-knowing. Is he omnipresent? Well, no, he specifically moves down the mountainside on the back of a cherub, right? By the way, if you're a fan of Italian Renaissance painting or really campy Christmas cards, cherubs are not little fat babies that fly around. Cherubs are these fiery-eyed messengers of God that would just turn you to ash if you looked at one. So you don't really want to encounter a cherub. You don't want real cherubs on your Christmas cards either, trust me. Right? So he moves in time and space. He's not really omnipresent. Is he omnipotent? Well, maybe. That seems to be the first omni concept that the Hebrews come to. Yahweh has no trouble extinguishing foreign armies. He has no trouble defeating alien gods. When the Hebrews lose a battle, they assume it's because Yahweh let that happen because he's punishing us. But there's something very curious about how Yahweh is depicted in the Hebrew Bible. In everybody else's religious folklore, you'll have stories of hero gods battling dragons or world serpents or whatever, various monsters, and they will struggle and they'll be victorious. But nowhere in the Hebrew Bible is Yahweh ever depicted struggling to do something. Never once does he break a sweat to get something done. If he wants it done, it's done. Right? So it's kind of curious. They seem to have been really, really impressed with the power of their God. And from the earliest conceptions, they saw his power as being limitless. So they're on the way to this modern conception of God as we would understand it now. Right? So keep in mind that when you're looking at these old songs, you are peering back in time. You are seeing language and metaphors that reveal not what God was, because I mean, we're puny mortals. How can we know what God is? We don't. What we're studying here is how ancient human beings grappled with the question of divinity. How did they understand what God was? How did they put it into language, into words, into imagery? And what you really want to look at is how that imagery changes over time. And we go from these old Bronze Age songs with a warrior god just bringing, hailstones of fire upon his enemies. By the time you get to the majority written version done in the 6th century, and you get to the creation stories as they understood them then, God is very different. He's a spirit moving over the waters. He's given them a moral law code to live by. He's creating a beautiful universe. So their human conceptions are going to evolve over the course of the centuries. And that's something that we can study in an academic and objective sort of way, analyzing language the way we would analyze any ancient culture's language. So that's a little picture of what Yahweh was in the early days. I'll see you for part 2, and we'll see the ancient Bronze Age rules of warfare, Deuteronomy 20.